Afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Irene Urueña, and I'm the moderator of this panel on women's rights and gender persecution. So, defenders of human rights are under attack around the world. In this panel, we will be discussing some specific forms of this threat and what can be done about them. We'll hear from situations in Afghanistan, in Iran, and China, and learn about developments at the ICC and at the US State Department. As we will see, some of the most promising developments emerge from the interaction between domestic, international, and transnational mechanisms of accountability. This has been evidenced in other contexts. For example, in Colombia, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has broken new ground by bringing charges of gender persecution against LGBTQI plus persons, specifically for the murder of a gay man as part of the execution of civilians to pass them as combat casualties in the false positives case. And the potential of this interaction will hopefully be enhanced by a new policy paper on complementarity to be adopted by the prosecutor of the ICC later this year. Focusing on these interactions allows us to push the frontier of possibilities in terms of what international law can do to address some of these threats. In particular, it shows three things. So the first one is that new players are key for accountability. So think of domestic courts, fact-finding missions, data-intensive reporting initiatives. And international courts really do lag behind sometimes. So the second thing is that legal scholarship, and particularly work that asks the woman and the gender question to doctrinal materials, is really crucial for developing some of these initiatives that we're going to hear about here. And then finally, in that context, a key issue right now is how to inject distributive and structural discrimination concerns into international criminal prosecutions. To discuss some of these issues, we have really a wonderful panel. And honestly, I'm honored to introduce them very briefly. And I really invite you to read their full biographies in the app, in the conference app. So first, to my left, we have Valerie Oosterveld, who is the Western Research Chair in International Criminal Justice at the University of Western Ontario and the Special Advisor on Crimes Against Humanity to the Prosecutor of the ICC. Then we have Huma Saed, who works as the Afghanistan advisor with MADRE, which is a global women's rights organization. And Huma is an affiliated senior researcher at the University of Leuven and has worked as a consultant with the UN, with the ICC, and other organizations, including the fact-finding mission in Iran. And she's going to tell us a bit about that. Lupin is a prominent Chinese feminist activist and scholar. She established Feminist Voices, a pioneering initiative that became the largest new media platform of women's issues in China until it was banned in 2018. Since relocating to the US, she has organized the diaspora Chinese feminist community and is currently pursuing her PhD at Rutgers. And finally, at the end of the table is Jessica Stern, who works at the State Department as a special envoy to advance the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons. So thank you so much for being here. Each of our panelists will give initially some remarks, and then we will have time for some questions. And we'll start with you, Valerie, please.
Thank you very much. I am really pleased to be here on this amazing panel, and I will begin, though, with the caveat that I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity. I'm going to focus my remarks on the crime against humanity of gender persecution, which, of course, human rights defenders all over the world raise as something that is happening in their countries. So let me start with persecution as a crime against humanity. In the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, it is defined this way: the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights against an identifiable group or collectivity on prohibited discriminatory grounds. So the central distinguishing feature of persecution is that it is committed on discriminatory grounds. And persecution as a crime against humanity has been recognized for quite a long time, over 75 years. It was included in the list of crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunal statutes, in Control Council Law Number 10 after World War II, the statutes of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, beginning in the 1990s, and the 2002 statute of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. But all of these statutes focused on political, racial, or religious persecution. And it was only the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which included gender persecution as a ground, as well as some other new grounds in that statute in 1998. Now, the term gender is defined in a skeletal way in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as the two sexes, male and female, within the context of society. But this is enough. It captures the fact that gender is a socially constructed norm around maleness and femaleness from the point of view of the perpetrator. But in 2022, the ICC's prosecutor adopted a policy on the crime of gender persecution, and it augments this definition, explains this definition by indicating that gender refers to sex characteristics and social constructs and criteria used to define maleness and femaleness, including roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes. As a social construct, it goes on to say, gender varies within societies and from society to society and can change over time. And the prosecutor's 2023 revised policy paper on gender-based crimes adopts the same approach. So that is the approach of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Now, I want to talk to you today about why this particular charge is so interesting from my point of view. It is, in my view, an explanatory and a linking type of crime. By this, I mean a charge of gender persecution can be used to help explain why many of the other crimes that are charged took place in that particular conflict or situation of mass atrocity. So for example, if the crimes against humanity or war crimes of murder or willful killing, torture, or rape are charged, it's the persecution charge that contextualizes why those took place. And it can also explain how those crimes took place, because it links together all of these crimes into a clear and identifiable pattern. Gender persecution is also a really interesting charge, in my view, because it can include other conduct that severely deprives political, civil, economic, and social human rights. Examples include the passing of gender discriminatory laws, the restriction of movement and seclusion of women and girls, the exclusion of women and girls from public life, the exclusion of LGBTQIA individuals from aspects of social, political, and economic life, including exclusion from professions, businesses, educational institutions, and public service. And gender persecution interacts with other forms of persecution, for example, in laws that prohibit or regulate intermarriage. And there are other examples of human rights violations that can fall within persecution, such as attacks on property, private dwellings, businesses, and symbolic buildings, for example, bars or restaurants where gay men or trans individuals gather, or maternity hospitals, or girls' schools. All of these are good examples of places in which gender persecution can be carried out. So in this way, I see gender persecution as a bridge between international human rights law on non-discrimination on the basis of gender and international crimes. So let me turn just for a moment to the case of prosecutor Al-Hassan at the International Criminal Court. This particular case opened in July 2020 and it closed in May 2023. And the trial judgment was originally scheduled to be released in January of this year, but is rescheduled to a future date because of the illness of the presiding judge and we don't yet have the new date for release of that judgment. But I raise this case because Al Hassan was the very first case at the International Criminal Court, and indeed internationally, within an international criminal tribunal, on the crime against humanity of gender persecution. So it's the first time that this case, this particular crime has been litigated at the ICC, and makes an important case to watch. And I want to point out that this case, like many other future gender persecution cases, I suspect, was charged also with another type of persecution. In this case, it was religious persecution, because the prosecutor alleged that victims were targeted both for their gender and for their religious beliefs. And this approach is understandable because, of course, victims' identities intersect, as we all know, and persecution is often carried out on multiple discriminatory grounds. Now, I can provide more information on the Al Hassan case in the Q&A, but I'll end by noting that even though the judgment is not yet out in this particular case, this Al Hassan case has been already instructive in a couple of ways with respect to the charge of gender persecution. First, it has shown one type of instance in which such a charge may be relevant, either for the ICC or for domestic prosecutions. That is, when an armed group overtakes a civilian area and imposes gender discriminatory laws or rules. And the experience learned in this particular case in investigating, framing, and explaining the charge can be helpful in the ICC's future work with respect to Afghanistan and with respect to Nigeria, as two examples. Second, this case has given a sense of how to explain to judges that gender persecution is a crime that overarches other crimes. It has shown, the prosecution has shown the judges exactly how this crime is the linking crime. And I will end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we'll hear from Huma first, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Renee. Honored to be here, and I'm very grateful to ACIL and in particular to Professor Lisa Davis, the former Special Advisor on Gender Persecution at the ICC, for this invitation opportunity. I will be talking about the cases of Afghanistan and Iran. I do follow the situation of Afghanistan very closely. It's part of my work, but I've also done some work on Iran. And I think, as well as, as part of the work that we also do at MADRE, and what also the Iranian fact-finding mission declared in its recent report, that both countries are exemplary situations of the deprivation of fundamental rights, the severe deprivation of fundamental rights of women, amounting to crime of gender persecution. So I will be talking a little bit about some of the threats against human rights defenders in both countries, how these defenders have been able to circumvent these threats, as well as what could be some short or long-term strategies. We don't have time to go into the background, so I'm focusing mostly on the last, basically, in the case of Afghanistan, almost last 3 years since the return of the Taliban to power in August 2021, where, as some of you may know, Afghan women have been robbed literally of all their fundamental rights, fundamental human rights, as well as the situation of Iran since the death and custody of Jina Mahsa Amini on 16 September 2022, that then led to an uprising basically in the country and to the movement called Women, Life, Freedom. So it's interesting because in both countries, and the two countries also share quite a bit culturally, linguistically, historically in other ways. The two main slogans of women's human rights defenders in Afghanistan, it became bread, work, freedom, and in Iran it's women, life, freedom. So they do have the element of freedom in common, but I think the other elements also speak of the differences in socioeconomic and other situations, especially for women in the two countries. So the kind of threats that women human rights defenders have faced in both countries, and these are documented, well documented, we could categorize them in three forms. One is institutional threats by security forces, and that includes imprisonment, torture, enforced disappearance, rapes, and other acts of sexual and gender-based crime, as well as killing, amounting to crime against humanity, including gender persecution, as this has been concluded in the report of the Iranian fact-finding mission. As well as in Madre's reports on Afghanistan. Madre has been working on a series of reports to demonstrate how deprivation of fundamental rights, severe fundamental rights, could lead to, it leads to, has led to gender persecution. This is Madre and combination with the Institute on Gender Law and Transformative Peace, doing these reports and analysis. Other forms of institutional threats have included verbal and psychological violence. For example, women in both countries have been labeled women human rights defenders who've gone on the streets protesting. They have been labeled as prostitutes, spies of foreign countries. That shows very clearly also the intent, the very discriminatory intent on gender ground of the perpetrators. There have been threats against family members of protesting individuals, threats against their friends. Their social network, for example, have been severely limited. In the case of Iran, for example, there have been accounts of people who, after imprisonment, because of their attendance in their protest related to the Women Life Freedom movement, once they were released, they were practically cut from all contacts and relationships in the society, because the security forces had asked all their friends, threatened their friends and contact social networks not to be in touch with them. So literally, some of them felt like they were out of one prison into another. They were at home, but literally in prison in some ways. Then there are societal threats by families, relatives, and sometimes local communities. Especially in the case of Afghanistan, there have been reports of some of the women human rights defenders who, after their release, they have been victims of honor killing in the family, because some of them were raped in detention, and that is considered, of course, a great dishonor for the family and community. Also, in the case of Afghanistan, unfortunately, the Afghan women human rights defenders, women's rights defenders in particular, they have lacked support from the male counterpart. In Iran, it was pretty much the opposite. I think one of the elements that the Women Life Freedom movement showed us was that the movement started by women, but the man stood side by side and behind women, and they paid a very heavy price. If you look at the numbers, men probably have been more casualties of the suppression by the security forces. And then we have social media threats. Is very common. I followed some, especially towards Afghan women activists. It can come from extremists, but also sometimes from commoners. How do they circumvent these threats and engaging in peace-building movement? In the case of Afghanistan, women are no longer able to go on the streets. They just go to home. They do their protests from home or online. Many had to leave the country, so in diaspora they're engaged. And here I'm going very, very quickly because I have only 2 minutes. And I go to some of the responses, like what can be done to support these voices. One of the elements that I believe could be useful is a recognition of gender persecution as a grant for international protection. And refugee law. As we heard yesterday at the panel, international migration law is not very feminist. The Refugee Convention does not mention gender as a ground for well-founded fear of persecution. However, over the years, the UNHCR has developed a series of guidelines and amicus briefs to shed light on the notion of gender persecution in the context of refugee status. In its 2002 guideline on gender-related persecution, it noted that, among other issues, severe punishments of women for transgressing gender norms of a society could amount to persecution on gender ground, or when the punishment for non-compliance is disproportionately harsh and includes a gender component. It noted that a pattern of discrimination on cumulative ground, including restrictions on the right to work, right to education, freedom of expression, may qualify as persecution and warrant international protection. The guideline recognizes that differing sexual orientation might be grounds for persecution. This includes homosexuals, transsexuals, and transgender people who may face violence and cumulative discrimination as a result of defying socially and culturally determined roles and expectations. And we have seen all of this in both Iran and Afghanistan. Referring to the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan since return of the Taliban in power, UNHCR noted in a statement that protection on the basis of gender may be necessary in situations when gender-based violence and discrimination are widespread, as is the case in Afghanistan and also in Iran. Several European countries, including Sweden, Denmark, Finland, acknowledge that cumulative impact of discriminating measures against Afghan women and girls amount to persecution on gender ground, and have decided to grant protection to Afghan women on basis of their membership to a particular social group defined by gender. So this is a really important development, and we hope that this would include more and more such activists who are at risk. I just mentioned two other issues very quickly. Gender persecution, that is a tool we have. You already heard from Valerie about that, but we really need to raise more awareness about that to use it more. It's a tool that is there. When I discovered it a couple of years ago, for me, it was such an eye-opening. And the other issue is the gender apartheid that probably some of you might have heard in the context of both countries. That is really important that it is codified in the Crime Against Humanity Treaty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uma. And it's really this, so the power of gender persecution to connect international criminal law to refugee law, to human rights law. So it's kind of bringing that conversation, and I think we're going to come back. It's very powerful. Lupin, please.
Okay, thank you. I will discuss the escalation of repression of the Chinese feminist movement since 2015 and the features of political violence against feminists in China, with sharing testimony of feminist activists. I will also talk about how feminists in China navigated repression to persist our movement. So since 2015, the feminist movement in China has faced three significant waves of repression. In March 2015, 5 activists were arrested and held for a month planning a street campaign against the sexual harassment. Actually, this crackdown was a rare example of repression that failed in recent years. The police were quickly compelled to stop their extensive investigations across the country and released the 5 arrested feminists, largely as a result of the collaborative intense pressure generated by the domestic and the international communities. At that time, social media censorship in China was in its infancy, allowing feminists to form underground groups to execute rescue efforts and to convey information to the international and domestic communities, all without much fear of persecution. So due to the absence of measures to harm victims' reputation or block or offset resistance information, persecution actually make the victims to be global hero status, but fail to instill fear and stop people from joining the feminist movement. So 3 years after that crackdown, we saw the rise of Me Too movement, and the Me Too movement surprised all preconceived notions of popularity of any social movements in China. So in an effort of crackdown on the Me Too movement, feminist voices, the first and the most influential feminist platform in China, was targeted for repression in 2018. While feminists quickly formed a solidarity group, they were prevented from communicating with the public due to censorship on social media platforms, and at the same time, a wave of slender campaign directed at feminists began to circulate on social media, accusing that feminists not only participated in the political activities of so-called foreign hostile forces, but also pimped Chinese women into prostitution with Western men. Although nobody can confirm that the government ordered the ban on feminist voices or the Slender campaign, the public understood all of those actions must have been ordered by the government. As a result, the government avoided accountability for achieving its fear-based suppression objective. So, from the suppressors' perspective, the only weakness of this campaign, this attack, this crackdown, is that ordinary netizens were not fully mobilized, while the crackdown, this crackdown forced our movement to decentralize ourselves, but it did not deter feminist organizers from working covertly. And so in April 2021, a huge attack on Chinese feminists occurred again. This time, the incident appeared to have occurred by chance when some apparently anti-feminist individuals were outraged by the popularity of a feminist personal online campaign against the indoor secondhand smoke. On social media, facilitated by a number of influential accounts who self-identify themselves as patriots, highly inflammatory political accusations combined with misogynistic insults gained tremendous momentum, which was boosted further by endorsements from governmental agencies speak on their behalf. Well, what many outsiders were unaware of is that the police actually intervened into this case very fast and deeply, and they created far more harm on feminists than those online. So again, the police operate covertly, arresting no feminists, but threaten them privately and individually, and stop them from speaking online. Additionally, the targeted feminists and allies, as well as their family members, faced direct and indirect punishments and threats from state security, household registry, business administration, landlords, property management, and many other state actors and non-state actors. Along with great fear and anxiety, some targeted feminists were forced to relocate or even fled China and thus stop their activities, at least publicly. And many other feminists stopped voicing and organizing out of fear of being attacked and investigated. With this incident as a focal point, the Chinese feminist movement's organizing suffered a significant setback in 2021. So between 2015 to 2021, the escalation of the repression of the feminist movement in China culminated in the stop of feminist organizing in public space without officially criminalizing feminism. So this chat shows how the Chinese government's repression of the feminist movement has expanded and become more comprehensive for last years. So I contend that two key characteristics define political violence led by the party state in China. Firstly, the regime not only perpetrating operation directly, but also engaging, enabling, or enforcing non-state actors to join in its suppressive agenda. And secondly, the state leverage traditional gender norms regarding status, relationships, and affective and behavioral patterns to enhance the efficiency of political violence. The objective of state-led political violence against the feminists aims not only to punish them for their activism, but also to neutralize long-term impact of the feminist movement by make feminists unable to do their activism anymore by including feminism from legitimate political sphere and maintaining traditional gender norms. For a more focused explanation, I suggest the concept of matrix avoidance to highlight the governmental-centered, multi-party participatory nature of political avoidance against the feminists, which maximizes the suppression's scope, duration, and depth while enabling the government to avoid accountability. And the explanation of kinship networks in political violence against feminism significantly embodies how the Chinese state collaboratively upholds authoritarian legitimacy with a patriarchal family structure. By politicalizing the family and utilizing family as a tool for state repression, the state leverages a traditional Confucian value that requires unconditional obedience to parent as a means to enforce obedience to the state. So this method is especially effective against the young feminists because daughters are often the most marginalized ones within the patriarchal family system. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lupin. Now we have Jessica's turn, please.
Can you hear me clearly? Great.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. There's something very special about being the rare few who are willing to attend a Friday afternoon panel. I'm really so pleased to be up here with this illustrious panel. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom today. And thank you very much to ASIL for the opportunity to address you. As Renee said, my role is as the United States Special Envoy for the advancement of the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons. And in my role, I am based at the Department of State, and I lead all foreign policy efforts on these issues. What this means in practical terms is that I work across the 77,000 employees at the Department of State to monitor and respond to attacks on the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons. This work takes many forms. It means engaging in multilateral spaces to ensure that when we talk about the universal human rights system, we really mean everybody. It means engaging with other governments, both to have quiet conversations behind closed doors when we believe that the rights of LGBTQI+ people are being attacked, but also having conversations in coalition with like-minded nations that are committed to upholding universal norms and standards. And one of the hearts of this work includes listening to LGBTQI+ persons and asking them to tell their truth so that when we're fighting for equality before the law, we can take their feedback to know where the problems are most acute and where the solutions are that they're pushing for. The broad framework of this panel is focused on gender persecution and women's human rights defenders. So there might be some people in the audience who are asking, what is the relationship of LGBTQI+ issues to this topic? I'm very glad to say almost every panelist has made these intersections for me, so I don't have to elaborate in great detail. But I always want to start by arguing, I don't think that LGBTQI+ rights or women's rights and gender equality can advance without one another. I would go so far as to argue that LGBTQI rights are impossible without women's rights and gender equality. And I would say, although it's perhaps less commonly heard, that I believe that it's impossible to advance women's rights and gender equality without also having LGBTQI rights at the table. And there are many reasons for that, not least of which because the principle of intersectionality brings more of us together. But it's also because the root causes of gender-based violence, gender stereotypes, and intolerance not only hurt all of us, but often target us in very familiar patterns. I think that in response to what is now, thankfully, decades of progress on gender equality in many, but not all parts of the world, in response to progress in the increasing institutionalization of women's rights, and expanding opportunities for LGBTQI plus persons in many parts of the world, we are seeing rising anti-democratic actors who frame progress on these issues, these forms as equality, as special rights, or rights that are only being demanded by some, or rights that should wait until after more important and more universal and more pressing rights are secured. And such actors increasingly claim that advancing the rights of women and girls and advancing the rights of LGBTQI plus persons actively undermines the rights of others. There are various myths and stereotypes and distortions that are used to back up these arguments. Some of these actors claim that they're defending the rights of women and girls and LGBTQI plus persons in the name of protecting children or protecting the family. But I don't think the protection of the rights of children or the rights of families is antithetical to supporting the rights of women and girls and LGBTQI plus people. I think we sink or swim together. And so let me just give a couple of examples of why I think these rights are crucially interrelated. The truth is that misinformation combined with sexism and the enforcement of reductive gender stereotypes harms all of us. Men and boys displaying behaviors or attitudes that are perceived as effeminate or in some way departing from traditionally masculine norms frequently experience stigma, harassment, and violence. Meanwhile, women and girls who do not conform to cultural norms of femininity are met with hostility and suffer coercive or violent repression, often are pressured to be fixed through so-called forced marriage, so-called corrective rape, and other forms of gender-based violence. And of course, if you read the news, you know about the specifically dangerous and violent ways that transgender and non-binary people are being targeted. But no matter what we hear said, the truth is that gender and sexual diversity are part of every culture, every history, and every tradition in every part of the world. I have just gotten the 2-minute warning and I have like 40 more things to say. So I'm just going to say that very briefly, a couple things, then can't wait for the Q&A. But these intersections are really urgent. Some of you may have heard about 2 landmark pieces of news this week. One was yesterday. The UN Human Rights Council passed the first ever resolution protecting the rights of intersex persons. This is a milestone victory, and it not only won in the Human Rights Council, but the resolution passed with 0 no votes. So what it shows is that when we do work intersectionally, when we set big and ambitious goals, victory is possible. I'm going to juxtapose that with news of something that represents a step backwards, which is that this week, Uganda's constitutional court largely upheld the country's Anti-Homosexuality Act, striking down only a few of the most vicious provisions. And what's really important about that decision is that Uganda has joined a very small club that has now established that the death penalty for consensual homosexuality is an acceptable form of punishment. And I would argue that when you really look at the Anti-Homosexuality Act, it has very little to do with LGBTQI plus people. To return to the theme of this panel, what it's really a test of is the rule of law and equality for all. And so I'll just end with a quote that gives me hope when sometimes it feels like it's in short supply. And it comes from Coretta Scott King. "Freedom is never really won," she said. "You earn it and win it in every generation." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I'll do is I have perhaps a very short comment while you think your questions, and then because I think that's what's going to be most exciting about the panel. So perhaps 3 things that I would like to highlight. So the first one is this idea that I mentioned before, this idea of how the crime of gender persecution really allows us to enter into a conversation with other areas of international law, particularly with human rights law and with refugee law. And I think that conversation is key, because through this kind of openness of the gender persecution, of the persecution crime in general, but in particular gender persecution, so we're able to bring the idea or the importance of discrimination to this conversation. So really, so persecution is a crime of discrimination. So the problem is equality, and this is something that came in all the interventions here. And that means that, so the key connection here is really how these gender roles are being violently enforced. So it's a system of enforcement, and therefore there's the connection between LGBTQI rights and women's rights, because it's a form of discrimination that is being enforced violently. And I think so. I think that this connection is important, because then we start having another set of conversations that we were not having when we're only thinking about sexual violence as the main dimension of gender sex violence. So because outside of sexual violence, then we start saying that the way to enforce the system of gender roling implies violations of property. And then we heard, we were celebrating a book in this very conference about that precisely. But also about, so regarding the roles, other roles of society in terms, for instance, of political leadership, in terms of cultural protection. So these kind of different social dimensions are crucial, and then we can see these connections. And the last point there is really, that is why the digital dimension becomes so important. As we saw here, like so the enforcement of these gender roles is, unless we're talking about armed conflicts, which is a particular case, but outside of armed conflicts, the violent enforcement of these gender roles is occurring through digital means. We heard about that in China. We heard about that in outside, even in other places of the world. And then, but I mean, when we think about it like that, then it makes sense. But we're not doing anything about that, because we're still thinking that the enforcement of gender roles is when armed actors actually do it. And so that connection is key. And I think a lot of more policy energy needs to be directed there. So those would be 4 points. What I would do, if you agree, are we should open to Q&A, but before, I don't know whether someone on the table wants to react immediately to any of the other interventions, or maybe we could get questions. Great. All right, so please, if you want, thanks. Just step up and then take the mic, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you so much. Please, if you could introduce yourself, and just we have good time, so thank you so much for sticking to the time. So please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Skylar Reed. I'm a 1L at UC Irvine, which is in California. My question is, how do you combat arguments about culture and religion that promote gender stereotypes and like gender apartheid? This is the only example I could think of. I know it's not a great one, but like female genital mutilation, I know is seen as like a cultural practice. So how do you combat arguments that, oh, it's a cultural practice, it's a religious practice, and that's why we do it? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this panel. It was very interesting to hear from all of you. My question also kind of relates to this question and is not about misinformation or gender roles in general, but more about disinformation and how you see that in the broader context of gender persecution and how it could be countered in terms of accountability at the ICC, for example, or other forum. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So maybe let's answer those questions, and then maybe we can get another round. Please, Valerie, you want to start?
I just missed the last. Did you catch the main part of the question.
Okay, yeah. So the question is whether,
I apologize.
so the question was whether how would this accountability, this way of enforcing the laws, would play out in the ICC?
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry about that.
Mhm.
Well, I mentioned one way in which accountability can be brought within the ICC, which is through particular charges of gender persecution in specific cases. I think another way is already set out in the 2022 policy of the prosecutor on gender persecution, which is that the idea of gender persecution as possibly existing in any given situation must be considered from the very beginning because of any particular examination or investigation of a situation, because it is an explanatory type of crime, a linking type of crime, as I mentioned before. So one needs to have it in mind from the very beginning in order not to miss how the puzzle pieces fit together. I think that's probably the most important part, is to have it as part of the toolbox from the very beginning, rather than come to it at the end after thinking, oh, identify, we have murder, we have torture, we have these things. Oh yes, maybe it fits together through gender persecution, but coming at it the other way around. I'll mention one other thing that I wanted to put out there, is that right now, literally as we speak, at the UN General Assembly 6th Committee, there's discussion on the adoption of a new Crimes Against Humanity Convention. So whether or not to go forward and have a diplomatic conference with respect to adopting a convention on crimes against humanity. And in that draft of the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, gender persecution is included, and there's discussion of adding gender apartheid. These are tools in a toolbox for domestic prosecutions, and I would support the adoption of a Crimes Against Humanity Convention.
Thanks. Huma, please.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So first thing, under international law, deprivation of fundamental rights, especially when it's enforced with violence, under the name of culture and religion, that is forbidden. Secondly, what rulers in countries like Iran and Afghanistan, especially in Afghanistan, for example, the Taliban, what they're doing in Afghanistan under the name of religion and tradition, and then they do say that, they do use those in their statements. It's not allowed in our culture because of our culture or religion. Women should not do this or that. This is not acceptable. I mean, what Taliban are doing, it has been condemned even by many Islamic countries. This does not represent even Islam or culture or tradition of people. In Iran, of course, they're not going to that extreme as the Taliban have gone in Afghanistan, but still, indeed, they're also enforcing it under the name of, Islam in culture, in those rhetorics. However, I think that this is political. All of this is political. The Taliban, I mean, we saw that since they took power step by step and steadily, they deprived women and girls from one right after another. And especially the closure of girls' schools. That is clearly a political act. What the Islamic regime is doing, and for example, in Iran, the mandatory hijab, that which really, I mean, it is the central premise of the ideology, of the discriminatory ideology of the Islamic Republic. It is a very political issue. It has, I mean, it is interesting because, in many other context situations, one would think, well, to cover or not to cover, that's a personal choice. But in a country like Iran, it is very political to wear or not to wear the hijab because of the way it's enforced by the government and the way it is resisted by women. So when you go to Tehran, for example, and you see women now without the hijab, you see like, wow, this is the result of the revolution that they did. So I think that, we definitely, in these discourses happening in the countries, among the people, I mean, many condemn this. They say this is not our religion. These countries have been religious Islamic countries for centuries. But at least in Afghanistan, the country has never experienced what it has experienced under the Taliban, whether this time or during their previous rule.
Thanks. Lupin, you want to comment? Okay. Jessica, please.
I think it was Skylar who asked the first question. Skylar, thanks for that. And for being a brave 1L and speaking up in this conference. We've been hearing that gender equality is not in my culture or not in my religion for as long as we've been fighting for gender equality. And so, there's no one size fits all argument for how to respond. I think there's certain universal tropes we can use, and also you have to tailor it to the given situation. But the notion that there are some religions and some cultures that really support gender equality, I think is a lofty ideal. I don't think there's a country on the planet that has a perfect track record on gender equality. If so, I want to go there right away and demand citizenship. But actually, we're all a work in progress on this. Sometimes I hear from those who oppose the, movement for equality for LGBTQI people. That's fine in New York City, where you have your pride marches, or in Washington, D.C., or in Stockholm or Amsterdam, but not insert the name of the country or the place. But if you open any newspaper in the United States or in Stockholm or in Amsterdam, you will also read about anti-LGBTQI attacks and attacks on the rights of women and girls in those countries. So one of the ways that I push back on this is just by insisting that gender equality matters everywhere, right? And that repressing the rights of women and girls and repressing the rights of LGBTQI people is a strategy to maintain a fundamentally unequal status quo. And that strategy does not serve us. We all benefit when we all can thrive. So that's just one point that I want to emphasize. And one more way I respond to that is that I don't think it actually helps, for example, when I'm serving in my capacity in the US government and I attempt to speak on behalf of others. That will never work. But what actually helps is when we lift up the voices of women and girls and LGBTQI people who are among the most marginalized and who are demanding recognition and to be listened to. So we don't have to make the argument, but we can give others the platform so that they can speak for themselves.
Thanks, Jessica. All right, so please, last question.
I'm Marcia Wiss. The question is directed to Professor Pinn, but it follows up actually on something that Huma Saeed just talked about in the context of Iran and Afghanistan. And my question is, what is the political motivation of the government of China to be anti-feminist? If I were to come up with a theory, it would be kind of a command and control system, maybe Confucian. I'm not sure that one could really say that, but that it's a means of control where people are told who they have to listen to, who's giving the orders, and who's following orders. So can you hazard a guess as to why I don't know if it's the party or just the government is doing this?
Thanks. And please.
Hi, my question's for anyone on the panel. My name is Catherine Tomaszewski. I'm with Charity and Security Network here in DC. I think we can all agree that everything is gendered and impacts of everything are gendered, and especially in the human rights field, we see not only overt attacks on women and LGBTQIA folks and led organizations, but also compounded effects of international laws and laws that were developed without women or gender in mind. And I think that these are often much more difficult to combat because they're not as overt or obvious. So my question is, what are some of the means and methods that we have for international law and also domestic law to combat these much more compounded effects and institutional issues?
Wow, two very difficult questions, and we have 6 minutes. So we do it in inverse order, perhaps? So Jessica, can I start with you, please?
Okay.
Thank you so much.
What means and methods do we have in international law to combat the exclusion of women as as drafters of the law and as people who should be the beneficiaries of the law. One great thing we could do is get women to have a seat at the table. I think that would be one of the places that I'd like to start, so that women are actually in government, at the negotiating tables, at the peace table, helping to say what forms of laws will be beneficial to them. I want to say from an LGBTQI plus perspective, one of the things that's been most useful is that due to the failure at the domestic level to obtain recognition and redress, regional and multilateral systems have been indispensable to the struggle for LGBTQI plus equality. And there are so many different tools there, but I will say the Universal Periodic Review has been an incredibly accessible tool for movement-based activists who are trying to change domestic laws. And I strongly endorse using the treaty bodies, because that is a system that is useful when a government has signed on to a treaty and is bound by it and is then found to be in violation of it, be it at the regional or UN level. It can have a transformative impact on domestic struggles. That's my effort to give a really fast answer.
Thanks, Jessica. Thank you so much. Then we have Lupi.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, we ourselves were surprised when we got cracked down by the government, because the feminist movement in China doesn't have any real political agenda to overturn the rule of party state. And yeah, but what happened? But the reality taught us that actually there are two theories explaining the repression, the motivation of the government. First, gender theories might say that because the movement offend the gender norm, traditional gender norms, because by empowering women, and it offend the gender norms or guided by the government. Another is that because when along with the development, growing of the movement, the scope, the impact and the influence of this movement already go beyond the security line, the red line of the government. So I agree with both of these two theories. I think they're fundamentally the ideology of the movement offend the traditional gender norm, and also the impact and impact and the score the movement has reached already make the government had no other options other than repression. And one of the major conflict in China now is that the women, half of the population is in the progress. 10 years almost 10 years ago, half of the college students are already women, and many women make their independent living in big cities and use internet to access information. And but on the other side, the government and the society haven't changed much. So there is there is a huge gap between the progress of women and the backward of the government and the society. So that's the root of the movement, and this conflict with the party states rule.
Thank you. Huma Saad, please.
On the first
You want to comment on something?
Well, I guess maybe just briefly about the question in terms of what can be done. I mean, also in view of the panel that I attended yesterday, very interesting about law and feminism. I mean, all the gaps that are there. But I mean, speaking from my experience working with mostly women in Afghanistan, I mean, Afghan women, including women human rights defenders, and particularly in my work with MADRE, we are also doing trainings on gender persecution or documentation through the lens of gender persecution. And many activists, human rights, women's rights defenders and journalists, for example, like me, when they discovered this tool like gender persecution, that it exists, we can utilize it. Afghanistan is currently under the ICC investigation. They were all amazed. simply they didn't know that this existed. And just like legal awareness, I mean, at least of the tools we have. It is true, there is a lot of, there's need for a lot of work to be done in terms of women's rights and law, but even in contexts like Afghanistan, Iran, with the tools that we have at the international level, unfortunately, many simply don't have any knowledge and awareness about that. So I would say that that is really fundamental. And then, of course, the question of participation at decision level making is key.
So good news for international lawyers that this is something that's actually useful for people.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is. And the translation, I keep saying, because, we do these trainings in Farsi. So it took quite some time to actually found the equivalent for gender persecution in Farsi, because, what we, like the sort of conventional translation you get simply does not convey the meaning. So we had to work on that. And then we realized how much that is really significant when we talk about legal, concepts.
So Valerie, last word?
Sure. Last word. I would just add to what's already been said in terms of what we can use. We can use legal interpretation. So there are many avenues through which a more progressive, more up-to-date understanding of gender persecution can be understood in the law. And we've seen this already in certain areas with respect to refugee law, and also international criminal law. And I think that there are more avenues that can be used to help develop this legal interpretation of what gender persecution is and does.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. And thank you for coming here. And then I have been asked to tell you that if you sign up to receive the CLE credit for this session, your code word is OTTER. So that's OTTER, OTTER. All right. So thank you so much. And please join me in an applause for our wonderful panel. Thank you.